Good morning, everyone. Today is Thursday, September 26th. We are about to begin our fourth and final, at least for this Elul season, study in this 4-week encounter with Maimonides, Mishneh Torah, Hilkhot Teshuvah, the laws of repentance, the way of return, which we have been doing for these weeks of Elul by way of spiritual preparation for the holy season, which is really now entirely upon us. Uh, Although Rosh Hashanah will be observed a week from today, beginning a week from yesterday evening, Wednesday, October 2nd, we formally begin the worship for the High Holy Days this Saturday night with our Slichot observance. Slichot is the night of penitential prayer that anticipates the season of awe. It really is a perfect time to apply what we have been studying in this class. So it's where we really begin to make tshuva in a formal, public way as a community and not just privately. And so at WRT, Slichot will be observed beginning at 7:15 p.m. on Saturday. So just as the sun is setting on Shabbat, we will gather with our wonderful guest, Alan Marinis, who is a scholar and speaker on the subject of Musar. Many of you who learned with Rabbi Bacon, her favorite subject in the Jewish tradition is Musar, which is a genre of literature and a discipline of learning and practice that is aimed at character development. So Musar really focuses on how to be a person of upstanding, righteous, noble character. And it seems like the perfect subject for us to encounter, contemplate as we begin the season of awe. Uh, Professor Marinis is a wonderful, very, very gracious, humane, thoughtful, compelling speaker. So the program I do not believe will be streamed. I can check on that. But if you are available in person, we'd love to see you at WRT. Combined with the other many Reform congregations in our little central Westchester area, I think there are at least 5 synagogues that are joining with us this year and their clergy. First, we'll have a program with Dr. Marinis at 7:15. And then at around 8:15 or so, we will have a Havdalah and dessert reception, followed by a service of prayer and song and story, where we will focus on Teshuvah and also dress our Torah scrolls in their whites for the holidays. So it's a very potent and poignant ritual, and I hope you'll join us Saturday night. And then, of course, I look forward to seeing you beginning on the holidays next week. So here we are, the last week of Elul, the last full week of Elul. Elul will contain a half week next week after Shabbat until Wednesday on Yontif. So we are really closing out the year 5784. And whatever else you think about the coming year, I think many of us are ready to say good riddance to 5784. It's a very hard year for the Jewish people. And we're ready for the hopeful possibilities that always come with a new year, even if not geopolitically, which do seem grim indeed as the war widens, not contracts at this moment. Spiritually, we can still orient ourselves with hope and possibility, and we do that through teshuvah. That's exactly what the process that Maimonides is outlining in his reader-friendly, user-friendly way is all about. So let's go right in. The last time we were together a week ago, we were in chapter 2 of Hilkhot Teshuvah, paragraph 4. Hang on one second. I don't know. What is this? My computer upgraded its operating system yesterday, so there are a couple of funny things that are popping up on my screen. I hope they will not prove disruptive to our class. So we were talking about how one makes teshuvah, and there was a kind of like a short practical list that looks like this. among the paths of repentance is for the penitent too, and then kind of just like bullet points. How do you actually do teshuvah? You can call out and make entreaty. You can perform tzedakah, distance yourself from the object of your transgression, so that which would provide temptation to transgress again, you distance yourself from that thing or potential, that action. You can even change your name as if to signal that you've taken on a new identity. You have transformed from the inside out, and a new name is a way of signaling the sincerity of that process. Um, Obviously, what they label as and Maimonides was not giving specific, numbers to this. It's just written in paragraph form. So it's interesting that the translator put it in this format, but change one's behavior in its entirety to the good and the path of righteousness. That seems almost like a summary rather than an additional point. And then they put a final one, a coda. You can go away far from your home. And this very interesting comment, which seems not just to be about personal teshuvah, but about the collective experience of the Jewish people. Our history is, of course, pockmarked with very long and painful periods of exile. Exile atones for sin because it causes a person to be submissive, humble, and meek of spirit. And, if you accept the traditional theology, I do not, but if you do accept the traditional theology that exile is punishment for transgression, so that the Jewish people collectively were exiled from their land because of their sins, which is a claim made in the rabbinic literature, one repeated in the prayer book, by the way. So I think that this is contiguous, consistent with that notion that exile had a kind of atoning function or feature to it, which was that it causes us to live with humility and submissiveness as opposed to the arrogance that comes with state power. This is a very interesting and one might argue timely subject. It's not really where we're going to dwell for most of today's class, but I was looking at it before the material that I prepared, which was beginning with paragraph 5 and following. And I was really struck by how traditional this comment about exile is in light of classic rabbinic theology, that the Jewish people's exile is classically understood in the rabbinic literature as punishment for sin. We did not merit to hold on to our land in sovereign ancient Israel. Not because, so our exile was not primarily a function or feature of Roman conquest and failed rebellion, but rather that we were arrogant and power hungry and bloodthirsty, and we strayed from the pure path of observance and mitzvot and adherence to the way of God. And as a result, we spent the next 2,000 years in exile, which led, by the way, or I would say is a key element of the theology of early classic anti-Zionism or early religious anti-Zionism. I don't want to get into the weeds of today's anti-Zionism from within the Jewish community. I'm going to do that on the high holidays for what it's worth. I have one sermon. I'm deciding whether to deliver it on Rosh Hashanah morning or Yom Kippur evening, Kol Nidre, which is a direct address to the anti-Zionists in our midst and really trying to contemplate what is the place of anti-Zionism in today's world. But at the outset of the Zionist movement in the late 19th century, there were always a small minority, but a number nonetheless of vocal, religiously motivated Jewish anti-Zionists who believed that exile was and should be the normative condition of the Jewish people as willed by God in response to our transgressions, which caused us to disinherit the land or cause God to disinherit us of the land, and that only at God's time and way of choosing should we return as sovereign masters in our biblical homeland. So these early anti-Zionists had all sorts of theological objections to Zionism because they believed that it violated the will of the divine. and that it was supremely arrogant for Jews to take history and destiny into our own hands by populating, settling, and eventually becoming the sovereign power with military force, of course, to defend ourselves in the land of Israel. So again, not, I think, deeply connected to the main thread or theme of anti-Zionism today, that most Jews who identify with anti-Zionist causes today, they may identify as religiously motivated, but they're not particularly concerned with this theme of arrogance in the face of the divine, right? That this is a kind of Jewishly immoral chutzpah that only God can decide when it's time to come back to the land of Israel. That is much more of a, uh, for lack of a better way of putting it, a Haredi or an ultra-Orthodox position of the extreme fringe within Orthodox Judaism that rejects the legitimacy of the state of Israel for various reasons, this being chief among them. All right, so that's a bit of a digression, but I think it's probably one that's going to tee up a few questions or thoughts, and I'm happy to take them before we dive into today's subject. Mom and Dad.
Not exactly on that topic, but could you comment further on number 3
Sure.
to change one's name as if I was a different person when that happened? I mean, how many celebrity apologies, politicians and actors, actresses from whatever uh, line of work find themselves caught up in some really horrible behavior that they did a while ago, and they say, well, that was me, that wasn't the real me, I'm a different person now.
Right.
Somehow that always rings hollow with me.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this briefly last week. The other place in Jewish tradition where changing one's own name is a sanctioned behavior in the sense of it's a permitted behavior or even an encouraged behavior is when one is confronting or has confronted a very serious illness. And one can change one's name. The superstition, I would say, some would say tradition. There's a fine and subjective line between that which is tradition and that which is superstition. You change your name to avoid the angel of death. And I've done this a few times, by the way. I've had members of the community come to me and say, Rabbi, will you bestow upon me or bless me with a new name? You don't need a rabbi to do that. I don't have any specific authority, but I conduct rituals as part of my work. So I've done it on the bema of Westchester Reformed Temple, change somebody's name when they have confronted a very serious medical diagnosis. This is not widely practiced. I don't know if it ever was. The idea that a name change was part of your repentance. I want to suggest that from everything else we're reading and the fact that, to my knowledge, it is mentioned only once and in passing, literally, I think it's 2 words in the middle of chapter 2. And Maimonides does not consider this to be the heart of the Teshuvah tradition. Far from it. So I would simply say, look at it in context and make not too much of it as a standalone comment, because it's clear that this is not where Maimonides wishes to put the emphasis. I'm making an educated guess here. He may simply have felt the need to incorporate a popular custom which was already being practiced that he did not wish to invalidate. Remember that Mishneh Torah is a popular work. It's intended for the Jew in the pew. And often rabbis make judgment calls all the time about, well, do we really want to tell the people they shouldn't be doing this thing that they're doing already? The other example that comes to mind is the famous debates that raged in the 11th century in the communities of Ashkenaz, of the Jewish Rhineland, about reciting names before Kaddish. Most of the rabbis of the time and place were actually opposed to this custom because they felt that it was a form of idol worship of the dead, venerating the dead. And they likened it to kind of like this is a seance. But the Jews of the Rhineland, the Jews in the pews prevailed. So one, again, I'd need to do actual research and not just armchair research. But one possibility here is that Maimonides is familiar with the custom of changing one's name to signal that one has made repentance. I certainly don't think he believes that there's any actual efficacy in doing so. In other words, I think it is not like a celebrity who says, I'm a different person now. I think you have to become a different person. And then if you wish publicly to signal that, that your teshuvah has been done gemura, completely and sincerely, a name change may have been a popular custom. But I'm mostly just guessing.
Thank you very much for a thorough and erudite discussion, Joe.
Okay,
Appreciate
thanks for
that.
the great question. All right, so alrighty, so let's then proceed from exile back into the mainstream of Maimonides' arguments about teshuvah, and we're going to pick up at section 5. V'shevach gadol. So I'm starting right here. V'shevach gadol. Shevach is praise. It's a great word. Shevach gadol. Yishtabach v'yishtabach. Or the word from the Kaddish. That's the God is praised. So yishtabach is from shevach. V'shevach gadol lashav sheyitvadeh barabim. So big praise. The kids would say props, right? Give proper acknowledgement. So big praise, lashav sheyitvadeh barabim, to one who returns. A shav is one who has made teshuvah. Sheyitvadeh, who makes confession barabim, in the presence of the many, or as is idiomatically translated, in public, right? So it is very praiseworthy for a person who repents to confess in public. Big praise for the one who is making teshuvah and who confesses in public. V'yodia pisha'av lahem, and who makes known. Yodia is from Yodea. Yodia means to make known. Yodea means to know. So it's just a different conjugation of the same root verb. The Yodia Pisha'av, and who makes known his sins or his crimes, his offenses, lahem, to them. Okay, so this is a theme we've seen since chapter 1, that confession is not incidental, but rather integral to the work of teshuvah. Praiseworthy is the one who makes his confession in public and announces or makes known his offenses to them. Umigale averot, and he makes a Megillah, right? Migaleh, to recount or recall or enumerate. Migaleh, to review. He makes a Megillah over his transgressions, shibeno levein chavero, that have been committed between him and his fellow. Beno levein chavero means between a person and one's fellow, la'acherim, to others. Ve'omer lahem, and who says to them, omnam, indeed, behold. Omnam is kind of in this phrasing, it's an interjection. It's an emphatic word. Omnam, indeed, or oh how, chatati liploni, I have sinned unto Ploni. Ploni is Hebrew for Joe Schmo, or Joe, John Doe. Ploni is just the generic term for a guy. Plonit for a gal. Ploni Almoni is sort of like that guy or Joe Schmo. So Le Ploni. He indeed, I have sinned unto, or I have transgressed with Ploni, this guy. Ve'asiti lo, and I have done unto him kach v'chach. Kach v'chach means this and that. I've done this and that to him. So Maimonides isn't giving specific examples. He's saying this is the formula for praiseworthy confession. You must confess in public. You must make known your specific transgressions and elaborate on them in the case of transgressions between one person and another by saying in the presence of others, I have sinned unto this guy and I did such and so. V'hareini hayom shav umitnachem. And this day, hareini, again, another word that means kind of behold, or and come see how this day, shav, one has returned, umitnachem, in order to attain forgiveness. Actually, mitnachem in this case means I regret it. So it is not enough for a public figure in particular, or even a private figure, to say mistakes were made, right? That is not praiseworthy confession. And notice we're not talking about necessarily what is the baseline threshold of confession. He is saying, here is how you do it in a way that is shevach gadol, deserving of real praise. Like, okay, as with everything we've seen thus far, Maimonides is a great uh, not just categorizer, but also an orderer. So you have the thematic topics that are lined up by theme, and he organizes that material, but he also orders the material in hierarchy, often from least to most severe or from most to least praiseworthy. In this case, he's starting with a very high level. If you really want to make teshuvah, he says, you need to make a public confession. You need to say specifically whom you offended. You need to say specifically what you did, and you need to express specifically that you are remorseful. It is not enough for Eric Adams. Oh, did I say that? Sorry. It is not enough for a public figure to say mistakes were made. And I think Adams is probably not going to say mistakes were made. He's going to say mistakes were not made. Nevertheless, he's in some doo-doo right now. Okay, Karen, question.
Okay, just three questions related to the language in the text you just translated. What does Peshav mean to you?
Oh, don't worry about what it means to me. I'm no authority. Amanda Cantor Kleinman 2 weeks ago unpacked that Maimonides is playing off of three words that refer to transgression in the Jewish tradition. So there's chet, which generally means to miss the mark, which is often an inadvertent failure to uphold a mitzvah or an inadvertent transgression of a mitzvah. For instance, I committed a chet, chatati, we would say chatati, when I woke up on Yom Kippur morning and poured myself a bowl of cereal, and only 6 bites in did I realize, oh my goodness, wait a minute, it's Yom Kippur, right? That's a chet, and culpability is still found for the transgressor, but it is generally a sin between a person and God. It is that can be more easily rectified. And we're going to get to this in just a few lines, that Maimonides makes clear that transgressions between a person and God or are of a different and lesser order than transgressions between a person and another person, which is really fascinating, by the way.
Yeah, you got to the meaning of it, and I was really at a more surface level. The word Peshav.
Oh, pesha means a crime, an offense, or a sin. Again, these are all words where the subtleties are kind of lost because our language doesn't have direct synonyms for all of them. So you only can gather from context exactly which kinds of transgressions are chet, which kinds of transgressions are pesha, and the third category is avon. And you'll see this in the nosei avon vafesha v'chata'a v'nakeh is one of the ways in which God is repeatedly described in the High Holiday Liturgy. God is a person who, not a person, God absolves us of pesha, avon, and chata'a. Chet, pesha, and avon, these three different categories. What exactly they meant to the originally intended audience or the people who wrote down these traditions, unclear. Like, is it about one is more grave than the other? But it's not clear, Karen, that like a pesha are crimes where blood is shed. That's not, that would be much too specific and again, beyond my ken to know exactly what differentiates a pesha from a chet, from an avon.
When you translated for us, last question, you used terms like this and that, for kach l'kach,
Yeah.
and you used piloni, the sky.
Mm-hmm.
It seems very modern in the language, or at least the way you translated it is modern. And I wonder, was it intended that way to be approachable? Was this particular text for you and me and everyone? Well,
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is intended to be like really, really easy vernacular Hebrew. This is
Okay.
intended for, now, of course, it is also reaching an audience where even the literate were not necessarily literate in Hebrew. This was not their first language. Maimonides, of course, was first based in southern Spain, in Cordoba, and then was forced as a refugee to North Africa, eventually settling in Cairo. So, what did the Jews of these places speak? Probably Spanish and Arabic or Judeo-Arabic. So Hebrew is the language of the Jewish pupil. It's a language of the educated, but even anyone in kind of like a cheder setting would be able to approach this Hebrew. This is not hard Hebrew. And I've said that many times. It's why it's a fun text to teach in synagogue adult ed, because even if you have a kind of a basic understanding of Hebrew, a lot of the text you can translate on your own. I'm not expecting that to be where we are as this class, but I think a lot of us derive a lot of kind of like opportunities to pat yourself on the back every time you say, "Oh, I know that word." So if you look at the translation here, this was not just me being casual. It is very praiseworthy for a person who repents to confess in public and to make his sins known to others, revealing the transgressions he committed against his colleagues. He should tell them, though I sinned against so-and-so, the word though isn't there, but I sinned against Plony, so-and-so, committing the following misdeeds. In Hebrew, it really does say, I did this and that. Behold, nobody ever says behold, so I try to avoid using it in translation. Behold, I repent and express my regret. So I translated it more casually as, oh, how I repent and express my regret, or boy, do I. But that's a legit translation. I'm not just playing fast and loose. Hareini, nobody says the word behold, so I hate it. I hate it when translators go to behold. That's not a word that people ever use. So we should come up with something else. Even Jay?
Yeah, I was always under the impression that you were supposed to confess to the person directly who you sinned against, who whatever
Yes,
you
right,
did to them. And this says in public.
right.
It makes it a little less one-on-one.
So the answer is actually it's going to be a both and, not an either or. This will not take the place of personal appeasement of the person you have offended. It is additional. And remember, so in addition to and this is really a very high standard that I would say most people would be very squeamish about. So, I offended this person in the community, and then I get up there on the bima and say, many of you were at the Oneg last week and you saw something happening with me and Jerry Wise, and it is true. I told him that his shirt was wrinkled, and he was horribly offended. And I have promised that I will never again do this, and that I will take his sartorial, considerations into whatever. So, it seems a little bit, I guess the word I would use is obsequious, to stand in front of a whole group of people and say, I offended such and so in the community, and here's what I did. But I think you also have to assume a very, very thick community where everybody is all up in each other's stuff and everybody knows everybody's business, kind of like the Jewish community, right? But not Westchester Reformed Temple is much bigger than what we're talking about. It's like a small little community of like 30 families where everybody knows what everybody else is up in each other's stuff about. So the public element is not to be discounted or even diminished. Okay, but we will, Eve, get to the one-on-one element of this, which he has not yet referenced. We're starting with, if you really want to do it in a praiseworthy way, you have to make a public, long-form, detailed confession and express remorse. V'chol hamitga'eh ve'eno modia. So this is fascinating because he's not only going to say what you did wrong, he's gonna ascribe motive. V'chol hamitga'eh, which means anyone who is full of oneself, anyone who is proud, anyone who's all puffed up, anyone who's arrogant, anyone whose ego gets in the way, ve'eno modia, and does not disclose, does not make known, Ela mechaseh pisha'av, but rather chooses to cover over, to paper over his transgressions. Ein teshuvato gemura. That person's teshuvah is not complete or maximal. And again, these are shades of gray. Maimonides is very interested in providing all the different levels, some of which are, in my view, more attainable, and some of which might be simply aspirational, and some for the less pious among us, and I count myself as not perfectly pious, like most of us. The highest levels of teshuvah might seem overbearing or as I said, forcing us to be obsequious as opposed to sincere. So please don't flagellate yourself. I don't think that's the point. If this year your teshuvah does not attain the highest levels of Maimonidean perfection, right? I think he's putting, I would submit, a fairly difficult high standard for, for attaining full teshuvah. But he is saying if your ego gets in the way, if you're all puffed up, if you are proud, your pride, the eno modia, and you do not disclose ela mechase pisha'av, but you kind of obfuscate. Mechase literally means to cover over. You hide what you've done. Ein teshuvah to gemura. This is not complete teshuvah. And here's our proof text. Shene'emar, and it's from Mishneh, which is Proverbs, Kafchet Yud Gimel, which is 28:13. And you can always click and bring it up on the right-hand bar. So Mishneh 28:13 tells us, he who covers up his faults will not succeed. I'm over here. He who confesses and gives them up will find mercy. So this is one of those examples where, wow, the proof text is about as pshat, direct, simple, plain spoken as it gets, right? So we have a direct proof text that says, Mechaseh pesha'av, if you cover up what you did wrong, lo yatzliach, that will not succeed. You will not succeed. And in Maimonides' interpretation, the thing you won't succeed at is making real teshuvah or full teshuvah. Bamed, and now he's going to get, this should really be a new paragraph, but it's all part of the same unit. Bamed divarim, with which words, with what words amurim should be spoken, ba'averot, about one's transgressions, shebein adam l'chavero. So what he's talking about, sorry, I mistranslated. These words that should be spoken concerning transgressions between one person and another. Here's how they translate it here. When does the above reply? Bameh, so I just missed it because they didn't put a question mark in the Hebrew. When does the above apply? In regards to sins between man and man. But again, I'm choosing a more gender-neutral expression between one person and another. Bameh divarim amurim, there should be a question mark right here. That's why I was struggling with the translation. My apologies. With what word or in what cases does one speak these this public confession? In the case of transgressions between one person and another, aval is but ba'averot sheben adam lamakom, between a person and the omnipresent one, lamakom, a wonderful euphemism for God that is frequently used throughout the rabbinic literature. God is the makom, which means the place or the source. But I like translating it the omnipresent one, the one whose place is every place, right? So transgressions between a person and the makom, the omnipresent one, eino tzarich lefarsem atzmo, one does not need to expose oneself publicly. The azut fanim hi lo im gilam. So this is really a fascinating comment. In regard to sins between a person and God, it is not necessary to publicize one's transgressions. Indeed, revealing them is arrogant. So whereas my offense at the oneg of a congregant, which presumably, stands the risk of damaging not just my relationship with this person, but our relationship, my standing in the community, his standing in the community. One is reasonable to ask, like, well, why does it matter that one airs one's dirty laundry in public? And the answer, I think, is that in Judaism, the assumption is always that matters between two people are public. Because in America, we have this virtue known as mind your own business. And in Judaism, we do not. Truly, we just don't have that. It's not a cultural ethos in Judaism. In Judaism, we have my business is your business. I think the assumption is that the business of two people is the business of the community, which again, none of these works if you extend it past the point of natural elasticity. There is a point where business between two people really shouldn't be confessed in public, in my view. That's Rabbi Blake, not Rabbi Maimonides speaking. Um, but then he goes on to say something really interesting. He says, this is only when there are transgressions between two people. That's when there's a public dimension. That's when I think he would say, whether you realize it or not, the community's involved in the affairs of two people in the community. And again, don't think of a community of 1,000 households. Think of a community that's much smaller, where what's happening between Plony and Plony, Plony and Almoni, is everyone's business, right? So that everybody's all up in each other's stuff. In contrast, a sin between a person and God is between that person and God, and you should not air it publicly. And in fact, if you do so, it is a form of arrogance. It's like, oh, well, oh, I'm so unworthy. Well, what would that be? I ate shellfish when I shouldn't have. That doesn't hurt another person, right? That's violating a Torah precept that, as it were, only offends God. And so you don't have to make a big, obsequious public confession and say, oh my God, I was the worst Jew ever. I ate a cheeseburger. I don't know how I'm going to live with myself. Like, that's for you to work out with your creator. Okay. Thoughts, comments? Okay, we'll just finish the paragraph. You can see it in English, but just so that is
Rabbi?
arrogant. Yes. Hi,
Yeah,
Alan.
hi. Nice to see you,
Nice to see you too. Welcome.
Jonathan. Thank you. I'm thinking of the portion in the High Holiday liturgy when we prostrate ourselves. And that is something I don't do. It strikes me as a very public demonstration of one's humility, and that in itself seems like a very unhumble thing to do.
Well, I want to clarify that the moment of full prostration in the traditional practice of the high holidays comes actually not on Yom Kippur and does not fall in the middle of any confessional liturgy. So, counterintuitively. So you have to look at, again, this is one of those things where you get some clues from the context. The prostration happens, and some of you are maybe not familiar with this custom because it is not practiced at Westchester Reformed Temple, though there is a very slow and solemn bow that appears to take a very long time in front of the ark. But in traditional communities, this one place of full prostration is practiced. Like, you get down on your knees and you flatten yourself to the ground. And yes, Alan, I agree that the early reformers actually thought that it was making too much of a show of one's own humility and piety, so much so to have the opposite effect than that which is desired. Instead of signaling humility, you're saying, look at how humble I am. This very public prostration. But again, back to the context. It isn't in the confession liturgy, which is part of Yom Kippur. It happens on Rosh Hashanah. And it happens actually in a traditional setting in the Musaf service. So the additional service, which we don't do Musaf in Reform, and thank God for that. But it happens in our services after the Torah is read, after the Haftarah, I think after my sermon this year, but that's of course not in the service. That's just something we decide to map in where we choose. It happens right before the shofar is sounded. And so the theme of the prostration is connected to introducing the sounding of the shofar, and it is done in the middle of Aleinu. It's the Vanahachnu Korim, but except that it's a different melody. It's called the Great Aleinu. So it's the Aleinu that opens the shofar liturgy, and it's the one that goes like this: Aleinu l'shabeach l'Adon. It's a beautiful melody. It is a melody that is considered one of Judaism's Sinai tunes, a tune that is so old and so storied that it might as well have come from Sinai. It actually is, the legend traces it to a 12th century burning at the stake of 32 Jews who were rounded up in the French town of Blois, where they were accused of the murder of a French Christian child, This is a fascinating blood libel case. I think noteworthy because it was the first time where they didn't even have a body. A child goes missing, and it was alleged that the Jews of Blois had murdered the child for ritual purposes. Using blood to make matzah was usually the charge that was leveled. 32 Jews were rounded up. They were locked in the tower of the regent, and they were burned at the stake. And the legend goes that as they were going up in flames, instead of screaming, you could hear them singing Aleinu L'Shabeach with this melody. Now, scholars of Jewish melody and Jewish music have noted that's a myth. It probably is actually much later than that, maybe 14th or 15th century, but still, that's an old tune. And on Vanachnu korim umishtachavim umodim. That whole part, which means Vanachnu korim, means we bend our knees, umishtachavim, and we bow low in the presence of Lifnei Melech Malachei HaMelachim, in the presence of the Holy One, the King of Kings. Hakadosh, Hakadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be God. Why are we doing this then and there? It anticipates the shofar service, which I would submit the primary meaning of the shofar service, and perhaps no one ever told you this, is that it is part of the coronation ceremony for God. One of the big themes of Rosh Hashanah is God is king. That's why the opening lines of the statutory liturgy on Rosh Hashanah are Hamelech Hayoshev Al Kisei Ram V'Nisa, the king who sits enthroned on the great and mighty throne. That's listen this year, pay attention. It's one of the first things we say after, Shana Tovah and some opening songs and ditties. The statutory liturgy is the king is enthroned on high today. And then we return to it at the very end with the shofar service, and we sound the herald trumpets, which are, again, they're associated with repentance and they're associated with the ram of the Akedah. But above all, the shofar service is a coronation ceremony where we say, you kind of forgot something really important. God is king. And we are going to reinstall God as our sovereign Lord today. So that's why we prostrate ourselves, because we're reenacting a coronation. It's not actually about, look at me, look at how pious I am, look at how humble I am because of my transgressions. Thank you for the opportunity to go down one of my favorite Rosh Hashanah rabbit holes.
Well, thank you very much. I really didn't appreciate that. The practice is still alive and well at Kol Ami.
Okay.
So I will, again, not do it at Kol Ami this year.
All right. So yes, look, prostration is not for everyone. First of all, we could talk about arthritis. Like, you're never supposed to do a Jewish ritual practice at the expense of your own health, safety, or life, right? Okay. So, but also for a lot of Reform Jews, like the full prostration thing is just a ritual too far. I happen to like it because I like embodied practice. I like living Judaism, not just up here or even here. I like practices that allow us to experience the beauty of the Jewish tradition through all of our senses and our full physical selves. But, early Reform Jews were kind of into decorum, and I think they found it unseemly with all of those hoop skirts at the time to come down on your knees and prostrate yourself. And there's this showiness to it, right? There's a little bit of shtick. So I don't discredit anyone who finds it simply not their jam. But there you go. All of this prompted by Maimonides' very intriguing and well-taken comments about real humility versus false humility, actually having piety and making a show of your piety, right? So I love the fact that although this is simple and direct and well-organized language, and thought, Maimonides is really granular here. He's like, well, pay attention to these subtle differences between making teshuvah with your fellow, which requires out loud confession, and making confession with your God, making teshuvah with your God, which does not require a big public self-flagellating, oh my God, I messed up with God. And that's why I would say, in a sense, we might in we might infer that transgressions against God are of a lesser order of severity than transgressions against people. And that in and of itself is an astonishing claim that the Jewish tradition seemed, and I think Maimonides would aver if he were here, he is here, but if he could answer, if asked, which is worse, transgressions between a person and God or transgressions between a person and another, he would say the latter, between a person and another. The harm is much greater. Right? God will recover. And if you don't take my word from what we've read only thus far, you'll see it in the next paragraph or two. Judy?
So many thoughts are going through my head.
Good, great.
One is the vulnerability of confessing one's sins against another publicly. It seems as though you're really putting, truly the shame is on there's extra shame in that you're doing this in front of people. The other thing, and on the other hand, it's so public, there's like chutzpah involved in having to do that. And does that relate to the Israeli stereotype of being more out there and not saying, okay, I've got to talk to this guy quietly. I'm gonna get it out and let everybody know. And having the coronation of God is woo. That's really anthropomorphic. So there's so many things to think about here.
Yeah, I'm gonna let your comment stand on its own because I think it's a really powerful thing you've noted here. Karen wrote in the chat box, by the way, about what other things besides eating a forbidden food might be classified as transgressions between a person and God. Stick around, we're going to get there. It's in the text. It's a couple of paragraphs down, but we should be able to tackle it today. Mom and Dad?
I was struck by the word arrogance in terms of confessing sins to God. And I'm wondering why that was chosen. I'm thinking along the lines of, well, confessing to God, to the all-knowing, to the omnipresent one, seems to be something that would almost be unnecessary because you would presume that God would know. So if
there's that, but
if you're taking it out sort of and expressing it, it's arrogant to think that God didn't already know that this had happened.
Interesting. I had a different read on it only based on the very specific way that the text is phrased. It's not about confessing to God. It's about confessing to the public about a transgression to God or against God, right? So if I transgress against another person, that's a public matter. If I transgress against God, again, so the examples that are given, by the way, Karen, are fascinating. Eating a forbidden food is the classic one. But one could say violating the Sabbath, presuming that no other people are harmed in it, right? You have to think about, well, who is harmed? Is only God harmed, as it were? Obviously, violating the commandment, thou shalt not take the Lord's name in vain, which doesn't have to do with uttering swear words so much as it does with making vows and then not fulfilling them. I swear to God that I will do X, Y, Z, religious obligation that I take upon myself as an oath, and then not doing it. That is using the Lord's name in vain. It's derived from a biblical ancient notion that the name of the deity held a kind of power that was not to be trifled with, right? So you don't use the actual proper name of Yahweh. I just did. But you would not make an oath using the proper name of the deity unless you were prepared to fulfill it. But that would be a transgression against a person and God. And the one they give, which is fascinating, is engaging in illicit sexual relations. Now, you might say, wait a minute, that could harm another person. And I think that although it is not unpacked here, I would need to do a little study. I don't think they're talking about the God forbid things of rape, incest, or even adultery. I think they're talking about illicit relations that you should not have had. But again, it's that one was hard for me to get because I'm like, wait a minute, how is that not a transgression between people? But you're going to see in a couple paragraphs, that's exactly what Maimonides says. So that one puzzled me. The point being, though, that if only God is offended, I like your point, Dad, that a confession might not be a public confession wouldn't be necessary because, of course, God knows already. You don't have to use words to say I'm sorry, right? You can feel it. Teshuvah, and we learned this from Maimonides. I'm not just riffing here. We learned a few weeks ago that for Maimonides, it's not just the words; you have to have the intention too, right? So with God, one might argue the intention is sufficient, even without the words. But there's also the subtle difference of if your offense was to God, the community doesn't need to know about it, right? So it's not confessing to God, it's confessing to the community that Maimonides says is not necessary in transgressions between one person and the divine. Whereas, again, an offense between two people is suitable and actually praiseworthy should one make public confession. Whereas coming up in front of the community and saying, oh my God, Rabbi, I'm your rabbi and I've had impure thoughts. In Judaism, who cares really? Right? There are things that don't matter or matter of a much lesser order. Like the stuff we should worry about are actually causing harm between people. Okay. So let us proceed. The next paragraph begins with a phrase that some of you know. It's a nice Hebrew phrase that's useful. Af al pi, even though, despite the fact. Af al pi shehateshuvah v'hatze'aka yafa le'olam. So there shouldn't be a period. There should be a comma. Af al pi, even though teshuvah and se'aka literally means crying out, making a geschrei over all the things I've done wrong. So it's part of the public confession piece. Yafa le'olam, or I wouldn't say it's actually about public confession. They say calling out to God. So I wanted to correct myself. Even though teshuvah and calling out or crying out, yafa le'olam, are always meritorious, literally are always nice. It's always nice. Yafa is nice, pleasant, good. It's always nice to do that. Ba'asara hayamim shebein Rosh Hashanah v'Yom Kippurim. All right, but on the 10 days that are between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, hi yafa bioter. It's even more nice. So yeah, you can make teshuvah on any Wednesday of the year, but it's especially, I don't love this word nice. I think he uses the word desirable in this translation. That's pretty good. Pleasant. It doesn't say efficacious, which is what I wanted to say, but it just says nice. It's better. It's really desirable to do it during the 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Yafa biyoter. Even more desirable. Umit kabelet hi miyad. And such confession, such teshuvah, is accepted immediately. Umit kabelet hi miyad. The antecedent for the verb here, umit kabelet, means it is received or it is accepted from Kabbalah. Kabbalah literally means that which is received. Mit kabelet hi, it is received, meaning the teshuvah, miyad, immediately. How do we know this? He brings a proof text, Shenemar, from Yishaya Nun He Vav. So Isaiah 55:6. Dirshu Adonai behimatzo. Okay, let's take a look at this verse. Seek God when he is to be found is the translation. A very typical poetic expression, as is found often in the Hebrew prophets. They write in poetry voice and not in prose much of the time, most of the time. Seek God while you can, call out while God is near. So why, for Maimonides, is that a proof text that teshuvah is most desirable during the 10 days? What's the connection here? This is a less overt proof text than the previous. How does Isaiah saying, seek God while God is near, lead Maimonides to conclude that teshuvah is best or most desirable during the 10 days? Alan.
Well, if God is going to be crowned, God's got to be around to receive the crown.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Like the whole point of the high holidays is God is as close as God will ever be. Right? The gates of repentance are wide open. you have direct access to the divine during the 10 days. The high priest goes into the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement. So there's all of this idea of the relationship between God and the Jewish people is being restored, and that assumes intimate or immanent proximity, right? There are two English words that sound alike. One is imminent with an I. Well, they both start with an I, but one is an imminent with an I in the middle, imminent, which means something is about to happen, right? A thunderstorm looks like it might be imminent today. Not clear, but it looks like it might be imminent in that way. What we're talking about here in the religious context is immanence with an A in the middle. Immanent. Immanent means physically proximate, the imminent presence of God in the sense of nearby. It is usually used as the antipode, as the antonym or the opposite word of transcendent, right? So the God of Jewish tradition is, I would say, at all times, both imminent, immanent, near, and transcendent, beyond. As gates of prayer, O God, you are as near as the very air we breathe, yet farther than the farthermost star. You may, if you're a Reformed Jew who's prayed a lot of Shabbat services, those words may have lodged somewhere. I like them. They're from the old gates of prayer from the 70s, but you are as near as the very air we breathe, yet farther than the farthermost star. You are both immanent and transcendent. Okay. And when is God most immanent? The high holidays. Ironically, when is God most transcendent? Also the high holidays. If you want to have it, like if you're ever trying to teach somebody about an oxymoron, a phrase or a pair where there's a paradox, the words contradict each other, military intelligence. Right. So Avinu Malkeinu is oxymoronic in the sense that it deliberately juxtaposes two opposite qualities of God. There's Avinu, God the parent, immanent, and Malkeinu, God the sovereign, transcendent. But I would say it's like Lucy from Peanuts with her little booth, the psychologist is in, right? God sets up shop during the 10 days and the Holy One is in. Okay, 10 cents. All right, let's read on. Dirshu Adonai b'himatzo. Seek God when God can be found, right? Or where God can be found. But here they make it clear that the b means when God is to be found. All right, well, when does this apply? Bameh devarim amurim. When do these words happen? Biyachid of it says in the case of an individual. In other words, this is about an individual who seeks teshuvah. If you approach God any time of the year, any day at all, it's always good. But it's especially good to do it during the high holidays. In the case of an individual, aval tzibur, which means the community, the whole public community, aval tzibur, kol zman she'osim teshuvah v'tzoakim belev shalem, any time that teshuvah is offered and crying out is done with a full heart, belev shalem, hem na'anin, they are answered. As it is written in Devarim, in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 7, Kadonai Eloheinu bechol kra'enu elav. Here translated, what nation is so great that they have God this close to them as God our Lord is whenever we call him? Just looking at the verse over here, what great nation has, for what great nation is there that has a God so close at hand as is our God Adonai whenever we call, right? So this is a part of what might one, if one were to take this to task, might call it a bit Jewish chauvinistic or Israelite chauvinistic. But this is Moses's final appeal to the Israelites. That's the whole book of Deuteronomy, is basically a Moses sermon to the Israelites who are going to inherit the promised land under the banner of Joshua after Moses has died. And Moses is stealing them and preparing them all for the journey. And he makes it clear that the real essence of their success as a nation now rests on their fidelity to the covenant with God. And he wants to make it clear that this God, to whom they must pledge fealty is not a distant, removed, transcendent God who cannot be approached. And this is a theme that comes up again and again and again and again throughout the book of Deuteronomy. We repeat it in the 30th chapter on the morning of Yom Kippur. It is not beyond the sea that one should say, who among us can go across the sea to get it? It is not in the heavens that one must ask, who shall go up to the heavens to get it? Rather, it is in your mouth and it is in your heart and you can do it. Referring to the way of God or the law of God, but really that's a stand-in for the relationship with God, right? So what Moses chooses to emphasize throughout most of the book of Deuteronomy is God's immanence, closeness, above and beyond God's transcendence. And Moses is saying to the Israelites, you can call on God anytime you like. So that's interesting. So Maimonides says, well, we've got these different traditions. One says it's best to call on God when God is already near, when God's, open for business. In other words, the 10 days of Yantif, of the Yamim Noraim, the days of awe, or as I will call them on Yom Kippur, the terrible days. Yamim Noraim, direct translation, means the awful days or the awesome days. Awful and awesome are the same word, by the way, full of awe. They cause dread. Days of dread, days of terror, days of fear, days of veneration too, but hear the nuances, right? But that's the time when God is near for a person, for an individual to make teshuvah. But Maimonides says for the community, anytime. God is always near. You're a Yid, right? You're a Jew. You're part of the Jewish people. You can approach God anytime. God is not checked out. So this is a lovely, it's interesting that although most of Hilkhot Teshuvah, most of Maimonides' Mishneh Torah writ large is a practicum, it's a guide to daily practice. This is theology as well. You're getting a lot of how Maimonides understands the relationship between the individual and God, the individual and another individual, and the community and God. All of this is getting discussed in these passages. Thoughts, questions before we move to the next paragraph? Wonderful. Okay. So now number 7. So we just talked about the 10 days, and now Maimonides moves to the 10th, the apex. And in fact, that's the word that's going to be used in the translation here. Yom HaKippurim. Did we say a blessing today? Oh, it's never too late. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Retroactively and incoming, we bless the opportunity to learn together. See? All right, now that was a transgression between me and the community. One might say it was between me and God. No, that was a whole community, but the gates were wide open. Okay, here we go. Thank you. Yom HaKippurim hu zeman teshuvah l'chol layachid v'larabim. So Yom Kippur is the time of teshuvah, or is a time for teshuvah, for all, lakol, for everyone, layachid, for the individual, v'larabim, and for the multitude, right? That's how they translate it here, more or less. Yom Kippur is the time of teshuvah for all, both individuals and the community at large. All right. V'hu kates mechila usalicha liYisrael. It is the kates. Kates can mean an edge or an end, but it also can mean the highest point, the zenith, the apex. I like the word apex here. It is the apex of mechila, which means forgiveness, and slicha, which also means forgiveness. So many different words in the Jewish tradition for these different shadings of what we're here to do in Teshuvah and what we hope to accomplish through Teshuvah. Mechila uslicha. It is the time of highest potential for forgiveness and pardon for the Jewish people. Not Israel, the state, Israel meaning the house of Israel, the Jewish people. Lefikach, therefore, chayavim hakol, everyone is obligated la'asot teshuvah, to make teshuvah, ulehit vadot, and to do confession biyom hakippurim, specifically on Yom Kippur. So again, lest you say, oh boy, this is repetitive, pay attention not to the similarities to what has already been said, but to the differences. The difference is now we are talking about the Day of Atonement itself. Up into we've talked, and again, if you look at like the Maimonidean way of categorizing things, you've got when is Teshuvah available to us? The answer is all the time, but most desirable during the 10 days, and now obligatory on Yom Kippur, right? So you've got every day of the year, all 365, 10, 1. So that's how he's ordering the way we think about Teshuvah as it is time-bound. And it is both open-ended, not time-bound, and time-preferred, and specifically time-bound to Yom Kippur, right? You following the different nuances here, which is what Maimonides is really good at, giving us a sense of how these things are ordered and classified. Okay. So specifically, everyone is obligated to repent and confess on the Day of Atonement, on Yom Kippur. And he gets into even more granular stuff around the timing. Umitzvat vidui Yom Kippurim, and specifically the mitzvah of making confession, of vidui, on Yom Kippur, sheyatchil me'erev hayom kodem, that it begins, yatchil means it will begin, me'erev, on the evening, hayom kodem, of the day before. Right? So when does the Yom Kippur mitzvah of confessing begin? Erev Yom Kippur. In other words, what we call Kol Nidre. You notice he doesn't call it that. That's probably because he didn't have the prayer. Kol Nidre is later, and it's Ashkenazi. So my guess is that Maimonides doesn't say from the moment you say Kol Nidre. Just interesting, Judaism is an evolving tradition, and it may be hard for you to imagine a time in Jewish history before Kol Nidre, but Maimonides would not have known it. Okay, Yatchil me'erev hayom kodem sheyochal, and actually you do it before you eat. So this is really interesting because that would be very difficult for me. I participate in a staff and family meal at Westchester Reformed Temple on Kol Nidre at 3 p.m. So, and that's because I have to be on a bima at 5. So my fast begins by 4:30 and goes until 7 o'clock the next day. So no whining. No whining if you're fasting. I've got 27 and a half hours or something like that before I eat. I do sometimes cheat and sin only before God, not before the community, by having a little extra water if I need it just before the morning service, just because I'm justifying that as I've got more speaking to do. But for the most part, I do a full fast from about 4 o'clock or 4:30 the day before until the next day. But Maimonides is actually saying, no, do it before you eat. Why? This is great. Shema yechanek basiuda, lest he chokes on his food, kodem sheyitvadeh, before he can make confession. So God forbid, it's Erev Yantif, it's Kol Nidre, well, he wouldn't have called it Kol Nidre, but it's Erev Yom Kippur, and you're about to serve the meal. You should probably make your final confession right then and there before you even light candles or taste the challah, because God forbid it could get lodged in your throat and you could choke and die, and you would be, as it were, intestate before God. You would not have made your confession. Mom and Dad?
Well, I feel validated because as a Jewish mother, we worry about everything. And this explains it.
Right, exactly. Yes, anticipate. And by the way, it also, I love that. Right? Don't blow it. Make your confession before you eat, because God forbid you could choke and die. Now,
I hope I wasn't that extreme, but I know I was very typical.
Yes. Well, I'm glad. I'm glad that the Jewish tradition provides you with validation and comfort. I would wish for it too. So look, I think that part of what Maimonides is driving at is echoed in the rabbinic literature. In the Mishneh, I believe, where it is taught, a person should make confession one day before he dies. This is echo. You might have seen this in the Machzor, because I think it's quoted somewhere in the many, many, many hundreds of pages of the Machzor, the High Holiday Prayer Book. Make confession one day before you die. And another rabbi says, well, how do I know when that is? And the other rabbi says, that's exactly my point. Every day, right? Do it now. Do your vidui now. And that's also why vidui is a deathbed tradition. In addition to when it is statutorily observed in the time of the high holidays and on Yom Kippur specifically, there's also the custom of a free will vidui that is offered before one dies. How do you know when that's going to be? You don't. So it's not just about making confession, by the way, it's about living in a state of teshuvah. Teshuvah, and I think this is something that I would wish to emphasize even when Maimonides doesn't. Teshuvah is not an act that you do once a year to wipe the slate clean and move forward. Unfortunately, I think that's how most of us have been brought up to think about it. Teshuvah is actually an orientation to how you live. You live in a state of awareness that you can change. And so you are constantly reminded that, wait a minute, I don't have to be the person I am today, tomorrow. It's a really beautiful and very spiritually powerful awareness to bring. Teshuvah not as a once a year act, but teshuvah as a minute to minute, day to day orientation to life. I think that's what teshuvah is really all about. Living with the awareness of possibility, potential, and change instead of saying, oh boy, I'm 51 now. I'm so stuck in my ways. I'm never going to change. Right? There's a lot of chokhmah. There's a lot of wisdom in the Jewish tradition that says, no, don't think that way. That's not how it works. It's hard. Change is really hard, but it is always open before you. But you have to do the work. You can't, God's not going to do it for you. And don't wait till the next Yom Kippur to have that happen either. Okay, so moving on, I think that what I've just shared, although it is very personal, it's my teaching. I think it's consistent with this teaching as well. The afal pi, there's that phrase again, and even though shehitvada kodem sheyochal, even if one made confession before eating, choser umitvadeh beleilei Yom Kippurim, you should go back and do it again. So you do it once, proactively in case you choke on your challah or brisket and die. But then you should go back and confess again in the evening service. Beleilei Yom Kippurim, the Balayla, at the night of Yom Kippur, Arvit, in the evening worship. V'choser, and you should go back, umitvadeh, and make confession, b'shacharit, in the morning service. Uva musaf, in the additional service after the morning service. Uva mincha, the afternoon service. Uva ni'ila, and the concluding service. So this is very nice too, because in case you needed a refresher, Maimonides is giving us the order of the Yom Kippur services. He says there is Arvit in the evening, which is sometimes known as Mariv, but the proper name is Arvit. It comes from the word Erev, though. You can see it right here. Just look at the consonants, not the vowels. Erev, right there. Arvit. V'choser, you go back to shul, and make your confession in Shacharit. So you got Arvit, Shacharit, Musaf, Mincha, Nila. And by the way, all Machzorim put the services in that order, right? Every good prayer book starts with the evening service. Sometimes kids wonder about that. I'm like, wait a minute, like in a Shabbat prayer book, it's like, find the morning service. It's actually after the evening service. Because in Judaism, evening, morning, afternoon, conclusion. Okay. Vehechan mitvadeh. So then it goes on to say, at which point, vehechan, when exactly in these services does one make confession? Vehechan mitvadeh. Yachid achar tefilato. An individual makes confession right after the tefillah, after the big, the avot v'imachot, the gevurot, all of the big prayers, which includes unatana tokef. After that is when you make your individual confession. Ushaliach tzibur, and the service leader, literally shaliach tzibur, or the shatz is the way it's abbreviated. That's the acronym for the shaliach tzibur. That's the person who's leading the worship. Literally, it means the emissary of the public ambassador. The emsat filato, the shatz, the service leader, puts a confession in the middle of the tefillah portion of the service, bivracha revi'it, actually specifically in the middle of the fourth blessing. So here they say an individual confesses after the Amida, and interestingly, they didn't even say Shaliach Tzibor, they just said Chazan. The Chazan confesses in the midst of the Amida in the fourth blessing, which is the extended blessing that includes Unetana Tokef and whatnot. So they're saying there are two different places for making vidui in the Yom Kippur liturgy, in the tefillah and after the tefillah. In the tefillah for the public service leader, after the tefillah, there's also time given for one to make private confession. Okay? Questions? Like this is really fun because y'all going to be doing this in the next 15 days. Yom Kippur starts 2 weeks from tomorrow. Who's counting? Okay. Havidui shenaha gubo kol Yisrael. So the vidui that it is customary for all Jewish people, for all of Israel to recite is aval anachnu chatanu. That should be in quotation marks, this phrase here. Which means, however, we have sinned, we have transgressed. It's part of the longer paragraph that says, we say we have not sinned, but we are not so arrogant to say before you, O God of our our God and God of our ancestors, we are perfect and have not sinned. Rather do we confess we have sinned, we have transgressed. And that's why unfortunately, he's only giving us the second half of the phrase, which is why it's a bit weird that it starts with the conjunction but. What's the but in reference to? It's what we said right before. It's we are not so arrogant and stiff-necked as to say we have not sinned, rather, but in fact, we have sinned, we have gone astray, we have transgressed. Okay? This is all familiar to you, but now you're really gonna like hear this liturgy in a very different way, I think, in a couple of weeks when we gather on Yom Kippur. Kulanu, all of us. V'hu ikar havidui. That line, he's saying, is the essence of the confession. For us to say, we have sinned, we have gone astray, we have transgressed. And now, this is interesting. Averot shehitvada alehem b'yom kippurim zeh, any sins which were confessed in regards to them on that one Yom Kippur, chozeru mitvadeh alehem b'yom kippurim acher. You got to go back and confess the same sins on another Yom Kippur. Well, wait a minute. How often is Yom Kippur? This is once a year, right? So this is a fascinating thing that I actually had not paid attention to until I was preparing for today's lesson. So what he's saying is, let's say it's Yom Kippur 5785. That's the Yom Kippur that begins 2 weeks from tomorrow night. Not that I need any reminding. No, nor do you. You go in and you're like, oh boy, I'm really kind of burdened by my conscience over this thing that I did wrong in 5784. So here comes Yom Kippur. It's my last and greatest opportunity, and it is a time-bound mitzvah for me to make confession on this Yom Kippur. Great. You make confession, you do teshuvah, it works, you're free and clear, and now it's 5785. And the year goes on, and although teshuvah is, as we have just learned, open to us at every possible moment of the year, we don't take as many opportunities to be aware of our potential for change or to entreat God, much less our fellow, for forgiveness, and we've got work to do. And the high holidays come, and now it's the fall of 2025. And we're getting up to Yom Kippur, and we've got a whole new list of things that we regret from this coming year. Maimonides is saying, oh, by the way, that thing you confessed last year, confess it again. It's still with you in a way, which is really fascinating because then it begs the question, well, does Yom Kippur clear me or does it not clear me? How blank is that blank slate? I'm thinking of the, you know how when you erase a blackboard, you can kind of still see what was written there? Kind of like that. Whiteboards too. Even on my Kindle, you can you turn the page and it's like, wait a minute, I'm seeing an image of that electronic ink. Yeah, it's still there. It may be buried. There's now a whole new bunch of layers of new stuff that you want to make teshuvah over. That old thing is still in there. So you may like or not like this. I merely find it intriguing. Again, it kind of caught me by surprise because I had not remembered this teaching. So sins which were confessed on one Yom Kippur, as it's translated here, should be confessed on another Yom Kippur. And then he goes on to say, even though one remains steadfast in repentance. So, like, even if you've not been recidivist and returned to the previous transgression, as it says here, Alehen b'yom kippurim acher, af al pi, even though you're getting a lot of that phrase today, even though shehu omed b'tshuvato, he stands firm, omed, right? Omed means to stand. He stands with his teshuvah. Stands in his teshuvah. He didn't lapse. Shinemar, and what's the proof text for this precept? It's from Psalms 51:5. Ki pisha'ai, for my crimes or my transgressions, ani eda, I am aware of them. V'chatati negdi tamid, and my sin is always before me. Oh boy, that's kind of heavy, and I would feel bad if we ended class on that. It's like you thought that making confession is a once and done. Wrong. Alan?
It's actually a very contemporary concept. When we say we all carry baggage, that's what Maimonides. That's what I hear him saying.
Yeah, I think so. And again, the converse of this is I don't think Maimonides would wish for us, nor do I think it is Jewishly warranted or authentic to be so dispirited by the burden of our own baggage that we give up and just say, well, what's the point? Like, if I can't release this burden from me through teshuvah and through one Yom Kippur, and I have to keep coming back, and it's still with me, why bother at all? And I think that actually overly exaggerates the burden. It is still cathartic, healing, and proper to make real teshuvah and to stand by it. But in a sense, this is true to the meaning of Yom Kippur. The word Kippur does not mean erase, destroy. It is not the day where your transgressions are forever vanquished. What it means is that they're covered up. They're no longer dangerous to you or others, right? They're neutered. But I like, Alan, your view of this in light of contemporary psychological insight that no, you like, that's your baggage. Maybe teshuvah is about learning to carry it better, carry it in a way that it doesn't damage you or others. So it gave me a lot to think about. I have to say, of all the lines that I came across in preparing for today's class, that was the one that really kind of spun my head a bit. I was like, whoa, hadn't thought about that before. Karen?
Thank you. I've always thought, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that the translation of Kol Nidre, the prayer, refers to the future. In other words, refers to the possibility of next year's sins.
Mm-hmm.
And I've spun, my own interpretation of it, but I'd like to know what you think of it.
Kol Nidre is a response to medieval Judaism and medieval Jewry, who were often put in terrible circumstances by Gentile authorities of having to make oaths and vows that they could not keep or would not keep. In particular, to swear fealty to the crown or to in particularly the church, to Christianity, in ways that would compromise their own Jewish integrity. And so Kol Nidre provided a formula for a preemptive nullification of such vows. That's really what it was about. But interestingly, the power seems to have held such a kind of like psychic grip on the Jewish community that it was enshrined as regular liturgy. That you can read more about it if you like just Google Kol Nidre, go to the Wikipedia on Kol Nidre. It's actually a pretty interesting entry. But it was intended to preemptively release Jewish people and Jewish communities from vows that were taken either willingly or under duress that could not be fulfilled. And getting back to what I said before about this idea of taking God's name in vain, it's not about swear words. It's about making promises that cannot be fulfilled. And so preemptively, Kol Nidre says, look, we know there are going to be promises we will make in the next year that we will not be able to fulfill. Let's just make sure that we have a legal formula where they don't count against us from the beginning, from the get-go. Now, on top of that, the danger of Kol Nidre is that it opens up Jewish people and Jewish communities to the allegation that we can't be trusted, right? If you have a preemptive formula that says your promises are worth nothing, are nil, right? They're not valid. That doesn't reflect so well on the Jewish community and can be weaponized against us. And was and has been. Judy.
That's what I wanted to say, that has been something that they've said, well, you've already confessed to something that you're doing, and you're not guilty for what you're about to do. You will do. It's a very anti-Semitic trope, I think.
Right.
The other thing about all of this is my feeling, it's a whole idea about what God is and who God is and where God is. And God is always inside. We make God. God is who we make, what we make of the divinity.
Yep.
So it's just interesting to think about all of this, to be in constant state of having transgressions. And yet, I guess it's just an ongoing, this is life. It's as you live your life. You can't get rid of something that you've done immediately, and you can't just throw away sins of the past. And yet you can't get bogged down in them either. You have to, there's always some kind of a hope that has to be, hope is eternal. I mean, you've got to think about things in a very positive way. And I think I don't know, it's just, again, the brain is spinning because there's so much here. And I must say, these sessions are really making the high holidays to be they're totally enriching from what we have ahead of us. And
that was the goal. That was the goal. And I know Cantor Kleinman, were she able to join us, but she is serving the community in a very, very loving way this morning. Feels the same way that when she and I sat down, it's like, no, we don't just want this to be, look, learning in Jewish tradition is actually considered to be most esteemed when it is done for its own sake. You're not supposed to learn Torah so that you can go out and make a lot of money or get practical advice that's going to make you, rich and famous. Having said that, when it comes to this specific learning in Elul, we wanted this to be not just abstract learning, but learning that will prepare us in spirit for the high holidays. So I'm going to take Karen's comment. I'm going to end with one comment of my own. By the way, you can all go on Sefaria. There are 2 more paragraphs in chapter 2. One gets into what specifically do we mean when we talk about transgressions between one person and God? And that's where he says eating a forbidden food or engaging in a forbidden sexual relationship, which is interesting, that's a transgression between a person and the makom. And what are transgressions between a person and another? But it more is a recapitulation of things we've talked about today than introducing dramatically new material. But, go and do it on your own. I think that this was such an enriching course of study over these 4 weeks that I have every intention that we might return to it next year. There's 10 chapters, so we got 8 to go. Karen, please. Nope, unmute, please.
To Judy, this is to Judy.
Oh no, Karen froze. Judy, you're going to have to find her on your own, or vice versa. Karen, if you're with us, I'm so sorry. That's sometimes just how the cookie crumbles. My friends, it's 11:45. These 4 weeks of Elul have been deeply enriched by being together with you and with my colleague, Cantor Kleinman. What can I say except even with how hard things are right now, and even with how easy it is, and not without justification, to blame our woes on that which is outside of us and outside of our own control. The work of the high holidays still is first and foremost introspective and not outward looking. So I hope that what we've done here in our learning will give us a little bit more depth of consciousness to approach the high holidays with meaningful teshuvah, with the possibility of restored relationships, with a deeper awareness of all the ways in which we can do better and have better in our lives. And above all, with a sense that the next year still, with everything, could be better than the one that has been. That's certainly my prayer that I wish to share with you. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may this be our will, and may it also be the will of the divine. I'll look forward to seeing many of you on Yontif. In the meantime, please stay well and safe and healthy. And I'll look forward to sharing with you a beautiful high holiday season beginning this Saturday at Slichot 7:15. Take care.
All about, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Shana
Thank
Tovah.
you very
Shana
much.
Tovah.
Thank
Happy and healthy
you
New
very
Year.
much, John.
Thanks, Judy.
And
See
for
you all.
wonderful,
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
good job.
Bye. Good job.